Hello, my name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm one of the senior attorneys at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Today, we're hosting a discussion on a new rule from the United States Department of Labor. That's a rule that encourages pension managers to consider environmental, social, and governance factors in their investments. This approach is generally referred to by its acronym, ESG, and the department argues that this change is going to give managers greater discretion in choosing funds investments, and it's going to lead to better results. On the other hand, critics of the ESG rule contend that this creates serious risks of politicizing investments and creating conflicts of interest between ideological managers and plan beneficiaries. In about 15 minutes, I'm going to conduct a discussion with two of our experts about the implications of the new rule. But we're going to begin our program with introductory remarks from former Secretary of Labor Eugene Scalia, who's currently partner at the DC office of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. And Eugene Scalia has a long and storied legal career, and it's a great honor to have him with us. When I worked for Secretary Scalia in the Department of Labor, he told us, and I think he was a little bit rueful about this and a little bit pleased by it, he told us that the harshest epithet that the New Yorker could apply to him when they wrote an article about him was that he's a cunning lawyer. And if I can inject a personal note, I'd like to say something about my experience working with this cunning lawyer at the department and the high standards we had there under his leadership. In the final months of 2020, the Secretary asked us to prepare a report on the looming pension crisis that's evident in state and local government. And I was the lead writer on this report, and it was about 40,000 words long. And I remember breathing a sigh of relief when I finished the first draft and sent it to his office. And I soon found it returned to me, and it was absolutely crawling with his comments in red ink. Now, nobody likes being edited, but I can tell you I've spent literally decades as a professional writer and editor, so I'm used to being edited. But for me, being edited by Eugene Scalia was an almost unique experience because I realized that as I entered his comments into my draft, I started to realize that almost every single one of his changes improved the text. And this was an unusual and humbling experience for a guy like me who thinks he's a pretty good writer. And I can promise you, especially in a political context, being subject to an editor who improves the text is far from universal experience. So I remember how the Secretary's counsel, Andy Kilberg, came walking into my office. He asked me how it was going. And I showed him this manuscript with 4 or 5 changes on every page. It was about 100 pages long. And Kilberg said, yeah, he was pretty pleased by it. He hardly touched it at all. And this was not actually the way I perceived it. But what this illustrates to me is not just Eugene Scalia's attention to detail or his editorial skills. It demonstrates to me how engaged he was as a chief executive. It illustrates to me how he pushed his appointees at the Department of Labor to routine excellence. And the nation has called him a fearsome litigator. And I can tell you from personal experience, he's a fearsome editor. And it is a really, really great pleasure to have him with us to talk to us today about the new proposed ESG rule. Thank you, Eugene Scalia, for joining us today.
Well, Dan, thank you for that very amusing introduction. It was a good and I think important report that you prepared and which was put forward by the Department's Office of Assistant Secretary for Policy. And you and I have discussed it since. I think it was a valuable contribution. It's a pleasure to join today's discussion on another very important topic, and that, of course, is ESG investing. Now, this is an area where there's certainly some controversy, and I expect that today's speakers are going to be exploring that. But I thought I would kick things off by noting all of the consensus, the common ground that exists in this area of ESG investing, and particularly as relates to retirement plans. First, we all know that there's been an immense surge in ESG-related investment in recent years. Morningstar reports that as of June of this year, there were more than $300 billion invested in what Morningstar calls sustainable funds. That's more than $300 billion, and that Morningstar said is more than twice what the investments were in those funds just 1 year earlier. Plainly, this is one of the most active, vibrant areas of investing. Second point of agreement, there are many investments today being touted for supposed ESG benefits that in fact they lack. Maybe that's partly an unavoidable outgrowth of my first point. There's a lot of interest in ESG investments, and there are a lot of funds out there catering to that interest. Some of them aren't all they claim to be. This was a concern of mine when the Labor Department adopted what remains its current rule on financial factors in selecting plan investments. This was a rule adopted, I believe, in November last year. But this concern I'm describing is shared by the Biden administration. It includes what some people call so-called greenwashing, where ordinary investments or even investments that might involve harm the environment are recharacterized as favorable for the climate. Earlier this year, the acting head of enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission signaled publicly that funds being promoted as so-called green investments can expect increased scrutiny from SEC investigators, due again to this concern identified, that the second point where there is indeed consensus. So here's a third point that's central to today's discussion. And again, I think on which there's broad agreement. When you're investing other people's retirement money, you have to act with what we call an eye single to maximizing funds to pay benefits under the retirement plan. A fiduciary can't subordinate the interests of participants and beneficiaries under the plan to other objectives, and a fiduciary can't sacrifice investment return to promote non-pecuniary goals. That's what we wrote in our 2020 financial factors rules. And simply, it's the law. It's what ERISA says, it's what the courts say. And actually, it's also what the common law said before ERISA. ERISA codified these common law views, which, by the way, is something that fiduciaries of government plans who aren't covered by ERISA still ought to be mindful of. In fact, even the department's new proposed rule, the rule that will be discussed today, still states that participants' interest in retirement income or financial benefits under the plans can't be made, quote, subordinate to other objectives, quote. And the proposed rule allows fiduciaries to consider investments, so-called collateral benefits, only, the proposal says, when competing investments are equally serve the financial interests of the plan. Simply, today, in an investment environment where there's great interest in using finance as a lever to address climate change and other matters, ERISA and retirement investment more broadly is a place you can't use investment in that way. So let me summarize. There's currently a great enthusiasm for ESG investment, point one. There are a number of ESG investments out there that are questionable, even misleading. That's point of consensus too. And third, ERISA is a statute that doesn't allow investment for a purpose other than maximizing returns for purposes of paying out benefits. Well, given these circumstances, do plan managers need to be cautioned about ESG motivated investment right now? Or do they need to be encouraged, even pushed, to make ESG investment decisions for retirement plans? The department's new proposal promotes consideration of ESG and makes a case for why it's needed. I'm going to leave it to this panel to discuss the proposal and how it does that. I'll just make one final observation. When investment managers go wrong, when they breach and run afoul of the law, it's seldom because they were too preoccupied with how to maximize investment value for the plan. You know, the Labor Department doesn't bring a lot of cases against plan managers who were just too darn focused on maximizing returns for participants and beneficiaries. Rather, when retirement asset managers get in trouble with the Labor Department or in private litigation, it's often because they were trying to use plan money to pursue other goals, to invest in a project that was of personal interest to them, for example, or to take another example, to invest in a real estate venture that would create a lot of jobs, it was thought, and bring goodwill with the community. I think in the environment we're in, the single best advice to plan managers, really as always, is tend to your knitting. With focus with an eye single on the financial interests of participants and beneficiaries, because that is what the law requires. It's what ERISA requires. Nothing the Labor Department says can change that. Nothing the Labor Department says can relieve fiduciaries from the liability that can result when they make investment decisions not to maximize returns, but to pursue other goals. Well, with that, I want to thank the Competitive Enterprise Institute for sponsoring this event, which is an important gathering on a very timely topic. And I want to thank you too for inviting me to say these few words. I know we all look forward to the discussion that will follow now. Thank you, Dan, thank you.
Eugene Scalia, thank you very much for an informative and a provocative talk. And now that we've had our ESG appetizer, we're going to move on to the main course. And so I want to begin by introducing our two experts on pension law and policy who are here to shed light on the ESG maneuverings that we see today. First, we have with us Tom Christina, who's a shareholder in Ogletree Deakins, where he practices employee benefits law. And Tom has represented clients in appellate matters on a wide range of subjects for more than 3 decades in cases before the U.S. Courts of Appeals and the Supreme Court. And he is also notable for, after the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, he became nationally known for discovering the law's vulnerability on the issue of premium tax credits for coverage purchased through the federal marketplace. This led to the Supreme Court's 2015 decision in King versus Burwell. And if only we had more justices who were as attentive to textualism as Tom Christina is, we would have had a very good result. We also have with us CEI's own Richard Morrison. He's a research fellow here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, where his work focuses on the relationship between economic and political freedom. But just as importantly, our focus is on you, our audience of viewers. And I'm going to have a number of questions for Tom and Rich today, but I also want to encourage every one of our viewers to keep in mind that you can type in your questions for them. You can enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And I also want to remind our viewers that today's program is particularly timely because the comment period for the Department of Labor's new ESG rule is still open for 6 more days. So I want to back up, if I may, and start with the basics and ask Tom to almost reinforce something that our previous speaker talked about. Here's a basic question for you, Tom. Tell us a little bit about this. What is a fiduciary? And when a fiduciary is put in charge of administering a retirement plan, what are the duties and goals of that fiduciary?
Sure, Dan. ERISA defines a fiduciary to include anyone who either gives investment advice to a plan, like a pension plan, for a fee, or anyone who has authority over the operation of the plan, or even if they don't have that authority, anyone who exercises that authority. At least as far as it pertains to our issues today, that means that the trustees of the trust that holds the plan's assets are fiduciaries, and their duties are to act solely in the interest of the plan's participants and beneficiaries, to act with the skill, care, prudence, etc., that a person charged with like responsibilities would exercise. In other words, executors of estates, trustees of private foundations, that sort of thing, and to avoid investments that incur the risk of large losses. So there is a prudence duty and a loyalty duty. And Secretary Scalia was exactly right when he said, by the way, this is not something that ERISA made up out of whole cloth. This is based on standard trust law.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was going to just add the reason it's
Yes.
important is that, with one exception that shouldn't trouble us here, all tax qualified retirement plans have to have their assets held in trust. So there is inevitably someone who is in charge of investing the trust fund.
Right. So this leads us to, I want to dip my toes into this a little bit, but this leads us to what I think of as an interesting question that really needs to be anticipated. Suppose I'm the fiduciary. Suppose I'm the person who's in charge of investment decisions for a pension, and I have pretty strong social or political views about the righteousness or the wickedness of certain business models or investment models. Suppose I think that buying corporate bonds that amount to investing in certain industries like firearms or fossil fuels or whatever, suppose I think that kind of behavior is politically dangerous and counterproductive or immoral. Can you explain how there might be tensions between what I'd like to do politically and what I'm supposed to do as fiduciary? And that question I will put to either one of you who would like to answer it.
Well,
Richard probably studies this more than I do. So,
well, maybe I can jump in there. Yeah, Dan, of course, that's exactly what the situation we're faced with, where the political and social beliefs of investment managers might be inducing them, nudging them to make investment decisions that are not in the best interests of the people who are the beneficiaries of their plans. So that's exactly why I think the department moved forward with the rule, which again, as Secretary Scalia pointed out, is still the current rule, even though it's not being enforced. And it is in fact a great temptation. And I think we'll probably get into some more of this later, but there are a lot looser definitions when it comes to a lot of the things that fall under ESG than there is when it comes to the rigorous traditional analysis on risk return of normal investments. So not only are investment managers likely to prefer investments that flatter their own social and political views, it's a lot easier to use wishful thinking to rhetorically justify such investments because they're less amenable to quantitative analysis inherently.
Right, and if you'll forgive me, I have a bad tendency or temptation that I want to stamp out of sometimes speaking in acronyms. And so before we go any farther, let's see if we can explain to our viewers, when we're talking about ESG strategies or ESG investments, what are we talking about? What's a good common sense way to understand what we're talking about when we use this term ESG, ESG strategy, ESG investments?
Well, in a way, it's difficult, I've often argued, because there's so much that could potentially fall under the umbrella of ESG. But as you said when we started, those letters stand for environmental, social, and governance. And so environmental could be all sorts of things: reducing air pollution, reducing water pollution, reducing greenhouse gas emissions relevant to worries about climate change. Social often has to do with how workers are treated, how they're paid, but also things like human rights of overseas workers, things like that. And then governance, really, in a lot of ways, is different from those other two categories. There's really more traditional concerns about corporations and how they're governed, whether the CEO and the board chairman of a company are the same person, or whether there's a significant amount of oversight within a board committee over things like compensation. So all of those things can be part of ESG. So measuring all of those different things simultaneously is difficult, and as a lot of scholars have pointed out, a lot of the measurements that we have don't often match up. Right? A lot of people will say, well, this company gets an ESG score of 57 out of 100, and then another group that's doing an ostensibly similar analysis will say, oh, well, no, we're giving them a score of 91 or 73 or what have you. They're often not consistent, even though they're theoretically measuring the same thing. But to be more perhaps responsive to your question, well, what's an example of a strategy like this? Well, if you want to get more specific and have a clearer strategy, you can say, well, we're operating an investment fund that does not invest. We are focusing on environment, and we're focusing on climate change. So we want to stop climate change from getting worse. So we are only going to invest in companies that do not produce any oil or gas.
Right. So I thought that you said so many interesting things there. I just want to sort of focus in on one. we had a question here about sustainability, and I guess I would be interested in a brief discussion or a brief analysis from you. How does one measure sustainability? Or is it difficult to measure sustainability or to understand what sustainability is supposed to be?
Yes, that's the quick answer is yes, it is difficult to have us to understand exactly what it's supposed to be. Sustainability, like a lot of these other terms that are associated with ESG investing, and specifically with environmentally themed investments, there is no single definition of what that means. So I think historically, if you go back, when did people start using a term like sustainability? I think it may be from an earlier era when people were a lot more worried about resource depletion. It's still something people are worried about today. People were more worried about it in the 70s and 80s. And so if you said, well, there's only a certain amount of copper in the world, in the Earth's crust, there's only so much copper in the world. And if we are using more than so many units per year, then that's unsustainable.
Right.
And so, and that can be applied to any process, the use or burning or consumption of anything. But here's the reason why I think that's sort of a problematic way to define things, is that if you take a look at what we're doing now and draw a straight line extrapolation into the future, well, probably you're going to run into some negative consequences at some point. If you say we're using the same amount of copper every year for the next 1,000 years, well, I suppose we would run out eventually. But in a dynamic market economy, we have innovation and change and growth, and that means we can have substitutes. We can dematerialize, which is that we can use less of the same thing to get the same product output. And it's the dynamic interactions in a market economy and the price system that allows us to do those things more efficiently and to take what might have seemed unsustainable, which is something that can't continue along in the future, and make it perfectly sustainable.
So it seems to me, and this is sort of a point that's been raised by some of our questioners in our audience. Can you? It seems like we almost have like a who will guard the guardians problem, right? I mean, if we have different ratings from different people, we have different measurements, right, about from different people about how well or how poorly people are doing, different investments are doing on ESG metrics. Is there any sort of agreed on way or approved way to look at the metrics and tell whether one set of metrics is superior to another?
There's one great way. It's called a market economy. And so when you have and it's entirely possible to have multiple frameworks and multiple competing standards. The Securities and Exchange Commission is looking at a rulemaking. We're probably going to see a proposal out in the next few months to require disclosure from public companies on climate change and possibly other topics, has been hinted at. And so that has led a lot of people to say, well, this will solve the problem of inconsistent data and metrics. The SEC will come in and set a single standard and say everyone has to report X, Y, and Z according certain parameters, and that'll make everything simpler, and then we won't have this problem anymore of inconsistency.
So, Tom, I'm sorry, you have something to add?
No, I was just going to say that I think that the SEC setting only one correct rule is exactly the wrong thing, and that we shouldn't say the only thing that matters is perfect consistency. I think that we have different approaches based on different values, and there isn't one that is obviously correct or superior to the others. The only way to test which one is superior is the process of a market economy, and we will see which one turns out better.
Dan, I was going to add one thing.
Mm-hmm.
There is something that the E, the S, and the G have in common. And that thing makes the problem of evaluation intractable. That what they have in common is the concept of a stakeholder. Because what these metrics measure is how well or poorly is a company behaving with respect to stakeholders. And the universe of stakeholders is much larger than just shareholders. it includes, the community in which factories have been located, tax districts, the environment, foreign workers, you name it. And you can infinitely expand the designation stakeholder in order to add some new cause into the mix. Since you can do that, you really cannot compare these investments, on any scale with any degree of confidence, unless you know precisely who the rating agency considers a stakeholder.
So our queue is starting to fill up with these questions, and I want to ask the two of you just a couple of quick questions that I think relate to what we've gotten into so far. Let me ask you to think about this, Tom. If I'm looking at two funds as a fiduciary, two possible investments, I should say, and one investment is more expensive than another, it's more costly, largely because it has higher fees, but it also has higher ESG ratings. Does the fact of higher expenses and lower return at some point approach a fiduciary violation? Does one endanger one's status as a good steward of investments if one gives too little weight to actual pecuniary returns? So can you say a little bit about the kinds of conflicts and possibility of fiduciary violations that this sort of thing might invite?
Sure. You've already pointed out one, which is the problem of the disloyal agent. The investment manager pursuing his or her own agenda. The other one, of course, is a question of fairness as among plan participants, because some of these plans cover thousands of people, and among those thousands of people, there are going to be some who prefer this social goal over that social goal, and so if the trustee invests in one fund rather than another, he or she is cutting out some of the wishes of the participants and beneficiaries. And then, as we've been discussing, there's this fundamental problem, which is it is not clear that any asset manager can or should try to decide, well, what is a good company as opposed to a bad company? They're not trained for that. So that they would be stepping outside of the confines of ERISA in the hypothetical you posed. In fact, every iteration of rules like this, going back to the 1980s, has always said, in effect, that the social purpose behind an investment is only a tiebreaker when you have two investments that have the same risk and reward characteristics. In a competitive market, I'm not sure there really is such a condition, because even today's high flyers are still what you might call profit insecure, because of the very grounds that Richard pointed to in his remarks. Competition changes things. So focusing on the pecuniary return is really the safest course.
Mm-hmm.
So Dan, that just made me think of something I want to chime in with on Tom's comments, that when it comes to the question of deciding what's a good company, as in like morally or ethically good company, that is a judgment that is completely outside the bounds of what we're talking about here. It's not outside the bounds of an individual investor who's making decisions just for themselves, but it's certainly outside the bounds of the concept of a pension fund fiduciary, such as a plan that's regulated by ERISA. And so, but I think this speaks to what I think is kind of a confusion about some of these ESG topics, which is that they're generally presented as all desirable. So that whatever falls under the E, the S, and the G, these are just a list of good things that everyone agrees are good and that we should do more of. And the debate in that case is, are they things that we should do or that we have to do? You know, are they necessities or luxuries, and can we afford to do all of these good things? Well, just depending on the perspective of the investor, the person who's evaluating them, they aren't all necessarily good things. In fact, some of them are terrible things we shouldn't do at all. So that, I think, is sort of, we need to sort of like reset what we think by these ESG topics and say, well, are they desirable outcomes? So if you have, there's lots of organizations that will give you a list, a big long list of, you know, these are the things that fall under the ES and the E and the S and the G, and we think companies should do this, that, this other thing. They're not all universally positive or advantageous, and certainly how they're applied in any particular case are not universally advantageous. So, you know, one example is you have a lot of you know, social conservatives out there, and you know, they don't necessarily agree with say healthcare that requires, you know, private employers to pay for you know, abortion or abortifacient drugs. You know, one of the popular, you know, most popular disinvestment drives, besides, you know, hydrocarbon energy, is against firearms and, you know, private ownership of firearms and firearm companies, and, you know, lobbying, you know, retailers not to sell firearms, for example. Well, there's a lot of people who are invested in an ETF that is specifically pro Second Amendment, right? So, well, there are a lot of kind of ESG campaigns and ESG topics that we probably would say are more, you know, like progressive left oriented. There's nothing about ESG as a concept that says anything has to be in that direction. And there's plenty of funds. Some of them are pretty small, but there's plenty of funds and investment drives in the other direction that, you know, have people wanting to invest in companies that have a good pro-life record, that have a good, again, Second Amendment record, that have a good First Amendment record when it comes to, you know, defending commercial speech and things like that.
Very good. I'm about to pepper the two of you with questions because I have many questions in the queue. So I'm going to ask you all for brief answers. First, let me ask you about the duties of a fiduciary who is looking after funds for a Catholic institution, and what possible conflicts there might be between fiduciary duties and some sort of religious override. If a fiduciary is looking after funds for a Catholic institution, is the fiduciary allowed to exclude investments in abortifacients, abortion-causing drugs?
I would say no. If there are two investment alternatives, one of which involves no abortions, the other of which does, and they have you know, different risk and reward profiles, the fiduciary has to go for the one that's going to maximize the value of the trust. Okay,
thank you. A second question about understanding ESG theory. So one argument for ESG investing is that funds need to sort of treat themselves as universal owners and take a very broad understanding of the interests of their beneficiaries. Everyone wants to retire with a good supply of income. Everyone wants also to have air that is breathable and a decent climate. And so the argument here is that the Platonic fiduciary will be able to skew investments towards stocks that will have a positive effect on the climate or limit climate change. Can you evaluate that sort of argument?
Well, I think that I guess there's really two questions there. You know, you said these sort of like, you know, Platonic ideal of the fiduciary. If we thought that that was a reasonable way to get at those objectives, then perhaps in general, right? But within the realm of ERISA regulated pension funds, I would say no. So, you know, we have this ESG investing has had this conflict for a long time, which is, you know, traditionally, you know, we said only invest for profits and then do everything else in some other context. So when it comes to, you know, environmental protection, we do that in the political context, right? Congress passes laws, administrative agencies issue rules, and, you know, that's our the way we make, directed efforts to have, cleaner air and water.
Thank you. Mhm. So can you explain precisely what the real world impact of the new rule is? In particular, could an investment manager or fiduciary run afoul of the government if the new rule is established for not undertaking ESG investing and not paying attention to ESG concerns?
I would say no. I think the new regulation, the proposed regulation, is permissive. It doesn't require taking those factors into account. Now, some of them may come into account in evaluating the business as a business. For example, a company that deals with hazardous chemicals, sometime or another, some of those will spill into a local river, so they're exposed to liability. But that's just normal, investment criteria being applied.
So, and I have another legal question for you, and this may be for you, Tom. Do you have any thoughts on the legal vulnerability of this new rule? How vulnerable is it? Who would have standing to challenge it? Can you kind of map out for us what things might look like if there were some sort of I don't know, public interest law firm or to challenge it? What sort of plaintiff they need to look for? You have any general thoughts on this?
We're supposed to give short answers, so I'll give you a short answer. I think it will be very difficult to find plaintiffs withstanding to sue over this prospectively. And that's because, for example, if the plan is a defined benefit plan and it's fully funded, as the Supreme Court decided last term, the participants don't have standing to sue for any breaches of fiduciary duty. So it's only in retrospect, when things go wrong, that there's the possibility of liability for the trustees, and the possibility of a successful petition for rulemaking to go back to the Scalia rule, if I can call it that.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask either one of you this question. I want you to imagine a situation in which a pension beneficiary has a certain amount of choice in his or her own investments. He can almost look at a website and pull up a drop-down menu, and this pension beneficiary has a choice. He can choose either an investment strategy that's solely designed to pursue risk-adjusted returns, or alternatively, this beneficiary can forego these risk-adjusted returns and instead place a small amount of weight on ESG concerns. If that investor, if that beneficiary is offered that kind of choice, would that be consistent either with the current rule that's not being enforced or with the new rule that's being considered? Do either one of you have any thoughts on that?
I hope Richard does.
Well, the disclosure is very important, right? And so at the very least, you would need to be, and that's one of ERISA's, fundamental requirements, is that pension fiduciaries communicate to the beneficiaries about what their status is, what they're going to be getting, what their respective returns are, what their status is. That was specifically written into the law to correct problems with previous pension plans where beneficiaries didn't know what was going on, and sometimes because they were being fraudulently administered. I think here's one thing. So when you said, say there's a drop-down menu, so you have 10 plans instead of just one that you're automatically in. Even choosing those, I would say certainly the current rule said even choosing those, you have to have a high bar for delivering returns. And even then, you would really only say that it's legitimate to offer an alternative one if it's sort of a tiebreaker and it's also as likely to bring you returns as the other options. Even if it's disclosed, if you say, well, this plan is the ESG gold standard and it has all the ESG markers, but it's going to give you 10% less returns. I don't think the current rule allows you to do even that. Now, obviously, it's possible to offer that to other individual investors, right? You can, if I'm an investment firm and just anyone can come up and invest with me, I can disclose that, and I can have customers who want to buy in and invest that lower yield but higher virtue, so to speak, version. But my reading of the current rule is that, or even the proposed rule for that matter, doesn't actually allow you to say, as a ERISA regulated pension fund fiduciary, to say, here's a pecuniarily inferior plan, but it's good ethically.
Oh, very good. So I want to sort of go over something that I think we've already talked about in the past. So let me ask you about a hypothetical fiduciary who is being governed under this new rule, let's say, and this hypothetical fiduciary says, I don't really want to get involved with any of this ESG stuff. I just want to focus on classic risk return stuff, the way we've been doing, the way I was taught. Does that fiduciary face any liability for just sticking with classic risk return analysis and choices?
I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. And so really the only effect of the new rule is on fiduciaries who want to explore ESG analysis, right? Because there's a reading of it, right, that says, well, this arguably is going to give a few more degrees of freedom than the old rule. Is that fair to say that it's confined? The effect of this is confined not to the traditional risk return fiduciary, but rather to the fiduciary who is more interested in exploring ESG. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say.
Mm-hmm.
In the preamble and description of the proposed rule, it mentions specifically that they are trying to correct confusion among investment managers, supposedly created by the previous Scalia era rule, and that they believe there has been an unwarranted chilling effect on investment managers considering ESG goals. I don't think that's entirely honest. I don't think there are that many people that are actually confused about it. I think they just dislike the rule. They don't like the fact that they're being reined in, that the still current rule reins them in and subjects them to a greater degree of discipline in their investing philosophy. They just want to have more freedom to engage in ESG adventuring. And I think the current rule, even though it's phrased very carefully, is also presented as a signal and a way to suggest that yes, there's much freer reign under this proposed alternative.
I've been looking at this rule, and I do have a question for you that was recently brought up by another contributor to our Q&A site. There's a phrase in there which really makes me worry about the possible ambiguity ambiguity in meaning of this new rule. The proposed rule says that the projected rate of return or the projected return of an investment or a course of action, quote, may often require an evaluation of the economic effects of climate change, unquote. And I sort of wonder, when I'm looking at this, I sort of wonder, is it possible to read that sort of thing, that sort of phrase in multiple ways? Because, and sort of related to this, I see comments or criticism from the Biden administration about the current rule, where they explain that the current rule, with its attention to focus on pecuniary factors, is mystifying or confusing. I don't see that word pecuniary as mysterious or puzzling at all. But I have to say, when I see someone saying, this may often require an evaluation of the economic effects of climate change, it's genuinely not clear what the operation of that is, whether that's a mandatory command to fiduciaries to use such considerations, or it's just sort of an innocent comment that's explaining how things work in the real world. Would any of you care to talk about these sorts of ambiguity questions? I know that's a
Well,
really
sort of.
large thing.
Yeah.
but
Well,
large-
sort of. Maybe it's neither of your suggestions. It's neither a command, nor is it a completely innocent, otherwise meaningless suggestion. I think it is certainly a nudge in the direction of what the administration wants its general policy overall to be, which is everyone needs to be taking more account of climate change related metrics. So with a lot of ESG investing, I think the real first question to ask is, well, which is the primary part? Is this primarily an ESG exercise, or is this primarily an investing exercise? So which is more important? Are we investing for returns and we're tacking on some environmental and social considerations, or are we really primarily trying to change social environmental policy and we've tacked on the investing part as an afterthought? So in the current rule, when in the preamble, when they're sort of describing and justifying, why they're doing this, they're pointing to, President Biden's executive order, 13990, that's all about climate change. And so it spells out, that executive order specifically spelled out several documents and executive orders that had been enacted under the previous administration that OMB was directed to reverse, and said that, every agency should, in general, move forward with policymaking in this area, including that, putting climate change really central. And the Biden administration has said we have a whole of government approach to climate change. Every government agency needs to be focused on climate change. And so this rule, which specifically cites that executive order, suggests that the ESG investing rule is not about protecting pension plan beneficiaries, and it's not about correcting any sort of supposed confusion with the previous rule. It's about enacting climate change policy. Well, okay, but ERISA doesn't say anything about climate change policy. We have a law that Congress passed in 1974, it's been amended a few times, but none of those amendments said you can use pension fund plan money to enact climate policy. So, and if the administration itself is saying we're basing this rule on this executive order that tells us to worry about climate change, then that's not a legitimate rule.
Right.
If Congress wants to pass an amendment to ERISA, as it has many times in the past for different topics, and say, no, actually, now it is okay if you use pension plan money for climate policy, they can do that, but they haven't. And until they do, you can't write a rule based on that expectation.
So I'd like you to follow up on something I'd like both of you to follow up on some things we've already discussed. We talked a little bit about the tiebreaker rule, right? And certainly in some manifestations of these ESG rules, I think the idea is something like you can use ESG considerations as tiebreakers. But I want to ask the two of you, if we get to a point where we're using ESG considerations as anything besides tiebreakers, is it relevant that, for instance, the SEC commissioner, Hester Pierce, one of the SEC commissioners, has said that ESG is inherently political, it's subjective, it's vague, and so it's really difficult or impossible to use ESG considerations in any principled way. Once we get away from tie-breaking, is there anything that satisfies what I think of as basically principled requirements or requirements of exactitude, or is the ambiguity of ESG rules and principles fatal?
Well, I think pretty clearly it is. So, and again, it depends how closely you try and define these sort of sub-issues of ESG. If you say ESG topics in general, well, that means almost nothing. If you say, well, we're going to really drill down here and we're going to say, what are the future financial risks to a company from Congress imposing a carbon tax? And then we can run some sort of, economic simulation about what we think that will be if we assume a certain price per ton for greenhouse gas emissions, and assume various other things. One, that it's going to happen in the first place. Two, when it will be phased in. Three, who it will apply to. Will it be carbon, will the border adjustment tax for imports? If you get down to making a much more specific assessment, then you get a more realistic approach and application. But at the level at which it is generally used, or generally projected to be used, or recommended to be used, the idea of, an ESG framework in general, which is just a theory of everything connected to businesses, then it is, of course, ridiculously vague and not something that you can base objective definitions and comparisons on. But if you do get to those specific, if you do drill down to the specifics, you often have to make so many assumptions on your way to a specific number and economic impact that, the error bars on your prediction are also very wide, which also, in a different way, suggests that maybe that's not a precise way for making decisions.
So I've been so delighted and diverted by these very interesting questions we've gotten from the audience. I now want to ask Tom, Richard, help me out here. Is there a question you wish I had asked you? And if there is, could you tell us that question and give us an answer to it?
Oh, I'm going to let Tom go first on that one.
Thank you. No, actually, I think the questions have pretty much covered the bases. I guess the only question I wish you would ask is, are there determinable circumstances under which taking ESG factors into account could legitimately alter an investment decision? And there, I think the answer is yes. There aren't many, but if you think, for example, that a given company is vulnerable to a boycott because of its social policy being out of step with popular opinion, that's something that directly impacts on its projected profits and therefore its current value. One of my favorite examples is the citrus industry. If global warming continues as projected by people who believe in this concept, my home state of South Carolina will become a competitor with Florida because our citrus industry will expand. So maybe people ought to be investing in something like that. That is not meant seriously as investment advice. But with those exceptions, I'm in general agreement with Richard.
Well, then one question is, at what point can guidance skirt statute? And it shouldn't, but of course we have plenty of situations in which arguably both administrative rules and what they call sub-regulatory guidance, these administrative documents, attempt to put a sort of spin on the enforcement of a certain law that may or may not have been intended by the authors of that law. So here's one question. I believe certainly in the current rule, there's some phrasing about mainstream investment philosophy. So the idea that well, as long as it's consistent with mainstream investment philosophy, then that's a reasonable thing. And there's lots of standards like that in law where we say it's the reasonable person standard, it's the reasonable investor standard. And mainstream whatever mainstream investors are doing is by definition the sort of like default thing. Well, a lot of ESG proponents have argued that ESG integrated investment is the mainstream investment philosophy of today. That the train has already left the station. We've already switched over. We've already had a paradigm shift, and now ESG integration is mainstream. Well, that's where there's sort of a conflict here, right? Because a bunch of investment managers changing their opinions about ESG integration does not amend ERISA, and it does not change the law. So you can have, and there's lots of situations in which it makes sense to use a phrase like that. The mainstream investment philosophy calls for this, but it can never override the expectations of the statute that the administrative rules are supposed to be implementing. So if we ever come to a conflict between the statutory requirements of care for fiduciaries to beneficiaries under ERISA and whatever quote mainstream investing is, we have to side with the statute. So that I would just caution people because you can sort of redefine. You can argue that, oh well, we've redefined what mainstream is, so now it's okay. Well, no, not unless you amend the law. It's not.
Well, I want to thank both of you for offering us such interesting and informative perspectives on this new rule. And I want to add that if any of our viewers are interested in looking at the new rule, we're going to be sending out, I think, a supplementary email with links. But you can also, if you're interested, you can go to the CEI website and look at my old blog post, which is entitled "A Note on Politicized Investment Policy" by Dan Greenberg. If you look at that post, you will see a link to the Department of Labor's new rule, proposed new rule, and you will also see an option for posting a comment, and that comment period is open for, I believe, 6 days more. And I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. And I'd like to ask all of you a favor. If you would, please let us know what you thought of this event. Please let us know what you thought of this program by filling out a brief survey that we will be emailing you. And if you enjoyed this, please join us for another online event in 48 hours, Thursday at noon EST. We're going to have a book forum with Tony Woodleaf about his forthcoming I, Citizen, a blueprint for reclaiming American self-governance. So, Tom, Christina, Richard, Morrison, thank you very much for explaining the mysteries of ESG to us. Thanks to all of our audience for joining us, and goodbye.